Before he died, Johnny Carson told the audience that 9 of his guests were gay. Johnny Carson let people into his living room every night for 30 years, giving the impression that he was close with Hollywood's biggest stars. But while the cameras were rolling and millions of people watched at home, the famous host of The Tonight Show was hiding shocking secrets that would have ended the careers of his most famous guests right away. A director who used to work with Carson on The Tonight Show and said, "Johnny knew everything," said this: "Stars would come on the show, charm the crowd, and talk about their relationships and marriages. Johnny would just smile, knowing that the whole public image of the star was a carefully constructed lie. He died knowing most of these lies." Carson, on the other hand, became more open with his close friends and family about the elaborate lies he had seen throughout his career, especially about the sexuality of famous people who lived double lives for decades, hiding their true selves behind studio-arranged marriages and carefully made public images. The most shocking thing he said was about America's most romantic, leading man, the heartthrob who sat on Carson's couch several times to talk about his marriage while terrified that the host would ask one question that would reveal his whole life as a studio-made lie. He also talked about the famous Hollywood couple whose 26-year romance was hailed as the movie industry's greatest love story, even though Carson knew it was all part of a plot to hide their sexuality from an angry public. It wasn't just general information or talk about the business. In a time when being caught meant losing your job, being shamed in public, and maybe even being charged with a crime, these were matters of life and death. Carson thought a lot about his reputation in his later years. He felt heavy carrying these secrets about how to do interviews, knowing that they were fundamentally dishonest. But first, let's look at the most shocking discovery. This is how America's most wanted leading man kept up a complicated lie through a studio-arranged lavender marriage while living in constant fear of being exposed on TV's most-watched talk show. This is how the score adds up. "You're the only thing that matters to me." Rock Hudson is a hot guy who has a fake wife. In the 1950s and 1960s, Rock Hudson was the dream man for millions of American women. Because he was tall, good-looking, and charming, he became one of Hollywood's most bankable love leads. He played opposite Doris Day in comedies that made him look like the perfect straight man. A former writer for The Tonight Show who knew Carson's private thoughts said the irony was amazing. Johnny was interviewing the guy that women all over America dreamed about night after night. Hudson knew that his whole public image was a carefully constructed lie meant to hide the fact that he was gay, but he still went on Carson's Tonight Show many times, charming viewers with his good looks and stories about his time in Hollywood. But people close to Carson say that these visits caused a lot of stress behind the scenes for both the host and the guest. Hudson was gay, Carson knew that. A former NBC official who worked closely with the late-night show said it was a well-kept secret in Hollywood. But he also knew that if the truth came out, it would be terrible for Hudson's career. Both men were very aware of the landmines around them during every conversation, so they had to dance carefully around the truth. Given that Hudson was a love lead, the pressure on him was especially high. Hudson's success was built on the fact that he was attractive to women who believed in the straight image that Universal Studios carefully crafted. This is different from character actors who might be able to handle rumors about their sexuality. A film expert who specializes in the golden age of Hollywood said that this wasn't just about privacy. His director, Henry Wilson, planned his whole life, including his marriage to Wilson's secretary, Phyllis Gates, to protect the made-up image that made Hudson famous. Things could not have been more important. Gates and Hudson were married for only 3 years, from 1955 to 1958. However, the marriage did stop rumors about Hudson's sexuality. People who knew Carson well say that the host found these studio-arranged lavender marriages to be especially upsetting parts of Hollywood's star system. A friend of the late-night show for a long time said that Johnny called it institutionalized lying. He didn't think anyone's sexuality was wrong, but he was disturbed by the complicated systems used to trick people. As a person who interviewed people for a living, having to take part in these lies worried him more than people thought. Hudson's sad double life came to an end when he died of complications from AIDS in 1985. He was one of the first famous people to die of the disease. Because of his illness and death, the world had to face his sexuality in a way that he had spent his whole career trying to avoid. A writer who worked on The Tonight Show during this time said that Carson was very sad about Hudson's death. He thought Hudson was stuck in a system that wouldn't let him live an honest life, and as he got older, he thought that his part in keeping up these lies was becoming more and more problematic. This complicated connection between public image and private truth would come up again and again in Carson's thoughts about the people he met in Hollywood. Not more dramatically than when he told the truth about one of the most sophisticated leading guys in movies. "Where are you going to live?" "Albany." "You mean Albany? Have a family up there?" "That would be my mom." The Secret Bachelor Hall is all about Cary Grant. Cary Grant set the standard for what it means to be an educated man for generations of moviegoers. His perfect style, British-American accent, and romantic relationships with some of Hollywood's most beautiful women made him the perfect ladies' man, and this image lives on in popular culture decades after he died. A former NBC official who knew about Carson's private comments said that the host had a lot of respect for Grant's skills. But the difference between Grant's public image and private life really stood out to him. Behind closed doors, this man, who literally wrote the book on style and grace, was living a very different life. Carson was most interested in Grant's long-term living situation with fellow actor Randolph Scott, who was best known for his roles in westerns. For more than 10 years, they lived together in a beach house in Santa Monica that was known as Bachelor Hall, among people in the entertainment business. When both Johnny and Grant were at the top of their careers, Johnny would tell the story of how he had to pretend he didn't know about Grant's friendship with Scott, which was a writer who worked closely with Carson. It seemed strange to him to talk about Grant's weddings. He had 5 relationships in his life, but he knew that his relationship with another guy was the most important one. What was so interesting about the Grant-Scott connection was how public it was while being officially denied. They weren't really hiding. There were pictures of them working out, making meals, and resting at home together that were published in fan magazines. The pictures made it clear that they were living together as a couple, not just friends. A friend who talked about Hollywood history with the host said, "Carson found those publicity photos very interesting." They showed the 2 men in bathrobes eating breakfast, working out and relaxing by their pool together. Pictures of a couple that we would know right away today. Still, the companies were able to make them look like bachelor buddies who shared costs. Throughout his career, Grant carefully crafted his public image by getting married 5 times to different women. History buffs have said that these marriages, especially Grant's, are classic cases of lavender marriages. Relationships that are mostly meant to keep up a public image of being straight while hiding same-sex relationships. A former Tonight Show writer said that Carson really understood how hard this was on people's minds. He knew that Grant had created a whole performative personality. Archibald Leach, who was born a man, created the Cary Grant character to help him get through a hostile world that wouldn't accept him as he really was. Carson never talked about Grant's sexuality in public, but in private conversations late in life, he was said to have said that he felt bad about having been a part of the machinery that kept up these lies. The talk shows, magazines, and publicity machine that made up stories about stars that had little to do with reality. A longtime friend said that Johnny thought his show was part of a system that made people like Grant live fake lives. He felt more troubled by the tension between fun and profit, between public story and private truth, as he got older and thought about his job. Carson's revelations about one of Hollywood's most famous relationships would bring up this theme of public fiction versus private truth again. A famous couple that the host knew wasn't at all what the public thought it was. Let him go by himself. I just want to make it clear that I mean that men can do many things. The 26-year lie about Katharine Hepburn. One of the most famous love stories in Hollywood is the one between Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy. A 26-year relationship that has been presented in books, documentaries, and movies as the perfect example of a committed relationship, even though Tracy wouldn't divorce his wife. But people who knew Carson's private talks say that the host knew that their relationship was much more complicated than the romantic story. A former Tonight Show staff member said that Johnny had interviewed Hepburn several times and grown to really admire her. He did find it interesting, though, how enthusiastically people had accepted a story about her relationship with Tracy that had big gaps in the truth. Carson privately shared with close friends and family near the end of his life that he thought Hepburn and Tracy's relationship was mostly good for both of them because it kept their jobs going while avoiding questions about their sexual orientations. Hepburn and Tracy's relationship served more than one reason. One of Carson's close friends remembered him saying, "For Tracy, a Catholic who wouldn't divorce his wife, it provided a socially acceptable explanation for his separation without the scandal of dating around. For Hepburn, it provided a reason why such a desirable woman remained unmarried, while giving her the freedom to live largely as she pleased." Carson had noticed that Hepburn's closest and longest relationships were mostly with women. She lived with Laura Harding, who was said to be her partner for a long time. After that, she dated Phyllis Wilborn for decades and called her wife, according to some biographers. A historian who talked about these issues with the late-night host said that Carson found it most interesting how the Hollywood publicity machine had turned what was basically a close friendship and professional partnership into the greatest love story of the century. It might have been the most successful myth-making job in Hollywood history. Tracy's drinking and long absences gave Hepburn a lot of freedom, and her love for him during his last illness solidified the story of their great marriage. The deal gave both stars cover while making a story that is so interesting that it continues to hide more complicated facts about their lives. A former co-worker said that Johnny would always point out how great Hepburn's plan was for keeping her privacy. Instead of going on dates or getting married that were set up by the studios, she mostly avoided the Hollywood social scene and built a life in Connecticut and New York that was away from the constant attention of the movie business. The Tracy relationship was the best way to explain this independence. Carson thought that Hepburn's androgynous style, which had an effect on fashion outside of movies, stood out as a way to add a touch of sincerity to a public image that was otherwise fake. At a time when women's clothes were very girly, Hepburn's choice to wear pants, flat shoes, and little makeup was a quiet rejection of gender norms. A writer who worked with Carson said that Carson had a lot of respect for how Hepburn had found a way to be somewhat real in a system that was meant to make people conform. She had learned how to live a respectable life despite the limitations of her time, which he thought was a truly admirable feat. This tension between public image and private reality would come up again when Carson thought about a star whose intense acts might have been caused by the stress of having two different lives. "Thank you, but it's hard to see. Please play it again. Marlon, we knew you were in town." The open secret about Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando changed the way actors were seen on screen with his raw, realistic roles. He became one of the most important actors in movie history with his part as Stanley Kowalski in A Street Car, named Desire, and later in movies like On the Waterfront and The Godfather. Sources who knew Carson's private talks say that the host was fascinated by the contrast between Brando's reputation for being brutally honest on screen and the way his personal life was presented. A former Tonight Show producer said that Carson met Brando several times and always found him to be very difficult. There was an actor who was praised for always telling the truth in his roles. At the same time, though, he was keeping important things about his private life from everyone, especially about his sexuality. Brando built a reputation as a straight, dangerous actor by having affairs with women that got a lot of attention and getting married several times and having many children. Carson, along with many other people in Hollywood, was said to have known that Brando's private life was much more complicated and fluid than his public image suggested. A writer who worked closely with the show said, "Johnny would say something about the irony." People praised Brando as the start of a new, more honest way of acting. The person who took the fun out of performance. He told big lies about who he really was and who he loved in his personal life, though. Brando became a little more open about being gay as he got older. He said in interviews that he had had sexual relationships with guys. But when he was at the height of his fame in the 1950s and 1960s, this part of his life was carefully hidden by studio publicists who focused on his marriages and straight relationships. A friend of Carson said that the late-night show saw Brando as someone who had found a lot of balance. He made up enough of a traditionally male character to keep people from looking too closely at him, while slowly pushing the limits of what was acceptable. It was a smart way to get around in a dangerous cultural setting. Hollywood was full of rumors for years about Brando's connections with other male stars, like James Dean. People who know Carson's writing say that the host was especially interested in how these connections affected the development of American ideas about what it means to be a man on screen. A former NBC executive said that Johnny thought it was interesting that Brando and James Dean, two actors who changed what it meant to be an American man on screen, were both supposedly in relationships that would have shocked the fans who looked up to them. He found it both disturbing and telling that there was a big gap between how people saw the culture and how things really were. Carson would keep thinking about this idea of image versus reality as he wrote about another famous rebel whose short career was surrounded by stories about how he got ahead in Hollywood. A real miles-per-hour timer set at 1067. James Dean the job he paid for. While he was only 24, James Dean died in a car accident. He was in only 3 big movies, but his roles in East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant made him a societal icon that will last for a long time. The perfect example of a troubled teen whose dark intensity spoke to a generation of teens looking for real feeling in a time when everyone else was trying to fit in. People who knew Carson well say that the host was very upset about what he knew about the young actor's rise to fame. Carson never talked to Dean. A former staff member who heard the host's private talks said, "He died before Johnny took over The Tonight Show, but he heard a lot of stories about him from people in Hollywood. Things that bothered him were the persistent claims that Dean had dated powerful men in order to improve his career. There were a lot of rumors in Hollywood, both during and after Dean's short life, that the young actor was pragmatically bisexual and willing to have sexual relationships with powerful people in the industry as a way to get ahead in the tough competition for lead roles." A writer who worked with Carson said that Johnny would talk about how these accounts of Dean's strategic use of relationships were different from the public picture of him as the ultimate rebel who was honest, uncompromising, and true to himself. He thought it was a very dark example of how the Hollywood system could change even the characters who stood for defiance against authority. There were rumors that Dean had relationships with Rogers Brackett, an important director who helped Dean start his career, and other strong men in the entertainment business who could help an ambitious young actor get jobs. A friend of the late-night show said that Carson made it clear that he didn't think these choices were wrong on Dean's part if the rumors were true. He saw it as an attack on a system that had such terrible power imbalances that smart young people felt they had to sell themselves in order to achieve. Carson was most interested in how Dean's early death turned these stories about him from things that could hurt his career into parts of his mystique. Because he died young, Dean never had to deal with the issues that came with being famous like Brando did. His picture was frozen at the most promising and possible time. A former coworker told Johnny that Dean's death had kept him from being scrutinized in a way that might have shown parts of his life that his fans would not have liked. His tragic death at a young age created a protective mythology that let different stories about his life live side by side without a clear ending. Carson saw this change from a possibly harmful truth to a romanticized legend as a powerful example of how Hollywood changes reality to serve its own cultural and commercial goals. A theme that would come up again when he thought about one of the most controversial stars in world film. One will always just say hello. That's all. You have been Marlene Dietrich, the most powerful androgen. Marlene Dietrich brought European class and a sexual secret to Hollywood that Americans found very interesting. From her big break in The Blue Angel to her work with director Isef von Sternberg, Dietrich created an image of sexy, rebellious beauty that broke rules in ways that not many American-born stars dared to try. A former Tonight Show writer said that Carson interviewed Dietrich several times and grew to admire how honest she was. He thought it was amazing that she had been pretty honest about her sexuality at a time when that would have been bad for an American star's career. Dietrich didn't try as hard to hide the fact that she was gay from people in the entertainment business as many of her peers did. Rudolf Speer was married to her from 1923 until he died in 1976. During that time, she had affairs with both men and women, including relationships with well-known actors and writers. One writer who worked closely with Carson said that Johnny was moved by Dietrich's refusal to be shamed. It became part of her image that her sexual sophistication and European background let her live more honestly than most American stars would dare. Her marriages gave her enough of a shield to seek relationships that were more in line with what she really wanted. Dietrich's style, her preference for wearing men's suits, her deep voice, and her strong personality all added to her androgynous look, turning something that could have been embarrassing into a seductive part of her attraction. She used her uncertainty as part of her charm, which turned a weakness into a strength. It seemed like Dietrich knew how to hide while still being seen by everyone. Well-known culture historian who talked to the host about Hollywood history. She didn't try to hide who she was. She styled it, and her fluid sexuality became part of her exotic draw to American audiences, who would have turned down a star from the United States if she was from Europe. The way she was married changed over time into what we might call an open marriage. Spare lived with another woman for most of their marriage while staying friends with Dietrich. The star felt like she was married, but she also had the freedom to find relationships that were more in line with her true feelings. A former co-worker said that Johnny found it interesting how the people in the press treated European stars differently than American stars. Dietrich was able to get away with things that an American actor would have been fired for right away. The double standard showed how much Hollywood's morals was based on looks rather than real ethics. Carson saw this smart balancing of public standards and private desires as a rare example of someone who had found a way to be truly themselves in the limited circumstances of studio-era Hollywood. Quite the opposite of stars who lived complex lies their whole lives. And then Raymond Burr, the lie that would last a lifetime. Before I could answer any questions, I think they kept telling me to speak louder. When he played the smart defense, lawyer Perry Mason, and then the wheelchair-bound detective Robert Ironside, Raymond Burr became one of TV's most famous actors. His strong presence and authoritative voice made him instantly known to millions of viewers, who had him over their homes every week for decades. A former Tonight Show staff member said that Carson had talked to Burr many times over the years. Interestingly, he thought it was interesting that Burr had made up a whole fake history to hide the fact that he was gay. Johnny had to act like he believed it when they were on air. Carson was especially shocked by how much Burr was lying, according to people who know what he thinks in private. He said he was married 3 times, with his first wife and their son supposedly dying in a plane crash during World War II. He also said he had been in the military but never served, and he said he had war wounds but never got them. It wasn't true at all. A director who worked closely with Carson said that Johnny said it was like talking to a character instead of a real person. He thought it was very sad that Burr had to make up not only a straight identity but also a whole sad background to get people to feel sorry for him and stop people from asking about his private life. During the last 35 years of his life, Burr lived with his partner, Robert Bendez, whom he met on the set of Perry Mason in 1960. They built a successful orchid-growing business and farm together, living together as a couple even though they told everyone else they were just business partners. A friend of Carson's said that what struck them was how hard this must have been on Carson's mental health. Burr was playing Perry Mason, a character who was committed to telling the truth and fighting injustice, even though he lived a life based on a complex lie because of the injustice that could have ended his career. Carson saw the irony in the fact that Burr, who played the ultimate truth-seeker in Perry Mason, had to lie all his life. He thought it was a very moving example of how gay artists in America in the middle of the 20th century had to make hard decisions. A writer who worked with Carson said that Johnny would think about the mental discipline needed to keep up such elaborate lies. Burr had to remember specifics about children that never existed and weddings that never happened. Such a show must have been very hard on the person's mind. When Burr died in 1993, Benvite's got his fortune and has been telling more and more about their time together. The fake biography has been mostly disproved, which lets us take a more accurate look at Burr's personal and professional impact. But the complex lie he kept up for decades shows how hard it was for gay celebrities in the middle of the 20th century in America. Didn't your mom tell you about that? There's a double fake with Charles Elton and Elsa Leicester in movies like The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Mutiny on the Bounty, and Witness for the Prosecution. Charles Elton made figures that people will never forget. His wife, Elsa Leicester, became famous as the bride of Frankenstein and was in many movies over the course of her long career. From 1929 until Elton's death in 1962, they were married. It seemed like one of the longest marriages in Hollywood history. A former Tonight Show writer who knew about Carson and Lester's private talks said that Carson found the Elton-Lester marriage especially interesting. People in the entertainment business said that both partners in this couple were gay, which was basically a cover story that helped both of their careers. People close to Carson say that the host had heard from many trustworthy sources that Elton was gay and that Leicester was a lesbian. This made their marriage one of the most complicated lavender arrangements in Hollywood, one that was meant to give both partners respectable cover while still letting them be free in private. A producer who worked on these parts said that Johnny talked to Leicester more than once after Elton died. He thought it was interesting that she had created a public image that respected her marriage while carefully ignoring details that might go against the official story of their relationship. What made the Lon-Lester partnership stand out was how long it lasted and how well it seemed to work. Some studio-arranged marriages ended because they were too fake, but the two actors stayed together for over 30 years, building what seems to have been a real friendship and creative partnership, even though they were not romantically or sexually connected. A friend who talked about Hollywood history with the host said that Carson saw their friendship as a creative way to solve an impossible problem. In a time when being gay meant losing your job, they formed a caring relationship that helped both of them do well at work and kept each other safe. In her 1983 book, Elsa Leicester herself, Leicester talked briefly about her relationship with Elton. She said that he wasn't an easy husband, but she didn't talk about his sexuality directly. The way stars of their age handled such touchy topics, even as societal views changed, was typical. They were careful to balance public disclosure with private truth. A former coworker said that Johnny thought it was amazing how well the Hollywood system had persuaded people that the marriage was normal. Elton had roles as both romantic stars and father figures. The women who played Leicester were wives and mothers, and people didn't question them in those roles. This shows how good they are as actors and how company publicity can change how people think about them. Carson thought that the marriage between Elle and Lester was a beautiful answer to the problems that gay performers of the time had to deal with, a deal that was good for both parties and helped both of them build successful careers while still keeping a level of personal integrity that one partner's lying could have taken away. The day is over, and so are all of its sweets. Nice speech, nice lips, nice hand, and nice breast. For Tyrone Power, the matinee hero, the secret is out. In the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, Tyrone P's good looks made him one of 20th Century Fox's most valuable properties. He looked great in romantic parts and had strong facial features, which made him a natural for roles as a swashbuckler, in movies like Blood and Sand and The Mark of Zorro. A former staff member who knows Carson's thoughts on the subject said that Carson never talked to Power because Power died in 1958, before Johnny took over The Tonight Show. Power's dramatic skills were shown in more important works like Witness for the Prosecution. But many Hollywood pros who were guests told him stories about him that painted a picture of a star who had a typical double life. According to people close to Carson, the host was especially struck by how powerful people, whose image was built entirely on their ability to attract women, kept their lives very separate. Their relationships with men were said to be very private, while the studio's publicity department set up dates for Carson with actresses to keep up his public image. A writer who talked about Hollywood history with Carson said that Johnny found it interesting how different P's public and private lives were. During the day, he was the ultimate star. 1,000 fan clubs were formed just because of his face. Hollywood insiders say that at night he looked for a partner that would have quickly ruined that carefully constructed image. Power's marriages to the French actress Annabella, the Mexican actress Linda Christian, and finally the Brazilian actress Debbie Ann Menardos gave him the security he needed for his work. These relationships, especially his 7-year marriage to Annabella, helped him keep up the appearance of being straight, which was necessary for his job. A friend of the late-night host said that Carson thought about how psychologically complicated these kinds of deals are. A lot of these marriages weren't just for show. There were real emotional ties and children were born. The truth about people was much more complicated than simple lying, which shows how few choices stars had who didn't fit neatly into social expectations. The most interesting thing about P's case was how his extreme physical beauty caused both chances and risks. His looks made him famous, but they also put him under a lot of scrutiny, and fans and viewers became possessive about his love life, which made it impossible for him to be himself without risking being judged. A former director said that Johnny would notice that the more physically perfect the star, the less freedom they had. P's face was his wealth, and the expectations that came with it became a prison. Carson saw the irony in the fact that his beauty gave him both freedom and limits. Power died too soon of a heart attack at age 44, ending his career and any chance that he could have adapted to the changes in culture that would make it easier for people to be themselves in later years. He, like many other people his age, went to his death hiding important parts of his life from the people who loved him.